This whole workshop, by the way, is like a mosaic. You know, you put a piece in and you put a piece in, and the pieces in themselves are understandable. But when you get the whole thing together, it makes even more sense, or another kind of sense. That's why we like to get the whole chunk at once if we can. When we reflect on Jesus and His gospel of mercy, when we reflect on Jesus as the incarnation of God's mercy, when we reflect on Jesus as the way of God's mercy, when we reflect on Jesus as God's merciful will for humanity, not just for us personally, but for everyone, it becomes clear that it is very, very important to try to get straight what Jesus said. Because if this is truly the Word of God, then what Jesus says is not just important, it's the most important thing there is in the universe. There is nothing more important. There is an area that Christians have been neglectful for in the extreme, for at least 1700 years. They have ignored, for all practical purposes, Jesus' teaching in it. And they have ignored it with abandon. That is the area of homicide and violence. It would seem that common sense would dictate that before proclaiming the teachings of Jesus to the world, one would first determine what the teachings of Jesus are. It would seem that common sense would dictate that before implementing the teachings of Jesus, one would determine what the teachings of Jesus are. But in this whole issue of violence and homicide, that is precisely what is not done. Almost universally, clergy and laity, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, bypass the teaching of Jesus on the subject and then form various opinions of one kind or another, which they didn't say are the opinions of, quote, our church, the church, or however they say it. And the opinions cannot in any way be found to agree with the teachings of Jesus on the same subject. It is a serious, serious matter. We are here confronted with the possibility that God is trying to reach into humanity with His almighty and His all-merciful love, and we're blocking it at a fundamental point because we will not obey, we will not trust in the teachings of Jesus regarding homicide and violence. As it stands today, most Christians in the church, regardless of what church we're talking about, most Christians believe that you can put a dagger in someone's heart under some sets of circumstances, that you can burn someone's face off under some sets of circumstances, and still be following Jesus. That repentance is not necessary, that one has done God's will as revealed by Jesus. When I say most, we are talking in the vicinity of about 95%, maybe more. That is, most Christians today believe that it is possible to kill and be justified doing it as Christian. The problem that is confronted is this. If Jesus were to teach that violence was to be rejected in the name of self-interest, self-defense, or social responsibility, and those are the three reasons for which people use violence. Self-interest, self-defense, or for social responsibility purposes. If Jesus were to reject violence, then for the Christian, not for the Jew, not for the Hindu, but for the Christian, that would be a divine mandate. It would not be just a good idea. It would be an imperative. For he who sees me sees the Father and I are one. And what Jesus says is the will of God. Therefore, if Jesus were to reject homicide and violence, the Christian would be under a divine mandate to do likewise. On the other hand, if Jesus were simply to say homicide and violence can be used under certain sets of circumstances, then the Christian would be under no obligation other than finding out what those circumstances were that Jesus was talking about. The problem is that Jesus could not have taught both nonviolence and justified violence. He could not have taught them because they are exclusive options. They are exclusive, not compatible moral options. To choose one is to abdicate the other completely. So, for example, the person who says, I am nonviolent, but is not nonviolent. The but is the place of the justification for violence. The but for some people may be here. The but for other people may be here. The but for other people may be over here. But the but is the place of the justification. Nonviolence is what the word means. No but. And those are the only two options, nonviolence or justified violence. No one suggests that Jesus taught an ethic of arbitrary violence. Just kill when you want to kill. So which is it that Jesus did teach? We can go through the details tomorrow, but let me begin with this. In the bishop's pastoral on War and Peace, 10 years ago this year, not May this year, the bishops say explicitly that Jesus Christ never employed violence. Never employed violence in order to protect himself. Never. You may remember at the time that the bishop's pastoral was published, some very conservative and wealthy Catholics became concerned about it, and basically they had a conservative philosopher by the name of Michael Novak write an 18-page article, I believe it was, in William Buckley's National Review. And basically the article was pointing out that the bishop's pastoral was all well and good, but it didn't change anything. Everything was as it was in Catholic theology before the pastoral, and he was basically right. But the point is, in the opening of Michael Novak's article, where he in the process is justifying, the enormous nuclear arsenal and the overthrow of Pinochet and that sort of business there, in that article, at the very opening of it, Novak, who is a major scholar, a major Catholic scholar, says, of course, Jesus was nonviolent. The reason he had to say that was to retain his academic credibility. For there is no question about the nonviolence of Jesus in terms of biblical scholarship. None whatsoever, whether it's Christian or Jewish. All justifications for violence today in the Christian community come from outside the gospel. Father John L. Mackenzie, who is perhaps the major Catholic biblical scholar of our time, I base that on the fact that the most prestigious biblical society in the world, group in the world, is a group called the Society of Biblical Literature. And it's you have to be voted into it, and it's a very limited number of people, and it's the major world scholars in biblical scholarship. And Father Mackenzie, in 1966, was elected the first Catholic and the first priest ever to be president of it. He's also the single most intelligent man I ever met in my life. Sometimes you meet people, and the intelligence is, you just know it's beyond anything that's normal. It's just, and not because it's just the opposite. Most of them don't put on airs or anything, you know. But Father Mackenzie says, regarding Jesus' rejection of violence, he says, if we cannot know from the New Testament that Jesus rejected violence, we can know nothing of his person or message. It is the clearest of teachings. Father Mackenzie, when he died, one biblical scholar who wrote an obituary called him the master of the declarative sentence. Father Mackenzie, publicly in writing, did not say words he did not mean. One of the reasons he did it is because people were scrutinizing his work so closely. And another reason was just because of integrity. Listen to what he said. If we cannot know from the New Testament that Jesus rejected violence, we can know nothing of his person or message. It is the clearest of teachings. That means nothing. It is the clearest of teachings means there is no teaching in the New Testament, whether it be Jesus' Messiahship, Jesus' Lordship, Trinity, Virginity of Mary, you name it, Incarnation, there is no teaching in the New Testament that is any clearer than Jesus' rejection of violence. That's where it is. That is a fact. It does not rely on one sentence. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. And we can go through that tomorrow. But from the beginning, through his last breath on Calvary, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus rejects the option of homicide and violence as a way of doing God's will, as a way for him and his followers being that leaven, that seed in humanity that is going to raise it into something else that it can't imagine. So when we are baptized into Christ, we are baptized into that, paradoxically, into that mustard seed, that little group that's the church, that because it has the power of Christ in it, if it will but trust that power, can do for humanity what yeast can do for dough. Can make it look altogether different than what anyone could imagine. To what a mustard seed put in the ground can become. The only problem is the seed has to trust in the power. And trust in the power means doing the will of God as revealed by Jesus. It does not mean saying, I trust in you. No verb is used more in the New Testament. No verb is used more in the New Testament by Jesus than the word do. D-O. Do. It is very, very clear that Christianity is an incarnational religion. That is, the truth of Christianity is not merely meant to be celebrated. It's not simply meant to be conceptualized. Christianity, fundamentally, the truth is meant to be made carnal in the person's life, is meant to be made flesh. The purpose of truth then is to live it in Christianity. The celebration of it, the conceptualization of it, are all well and good and proper and right in the ad, providing one thing. It doesn't stop with celebration and conceptualization, but that they lead to the one fundamental reality, doing it, enfleshing it, living it. Christianity is an incarnational religion. And in incarnating the truth of Christ, we incarnate the truth of God. Because Christ is God. And in incarnating it, we allow ourselves to become agents, yeast, mustard seeds, to do for humanity what humanity can never do for itself. And not that we do it, we just cooperate. It's God that does it. And what humanity can never do for itself is bring itself peace. Peace of mind, soul, body, spirit. Peace of relationship, peace with God. Peace in time and peace for eternity. Impossible for humanity to do for itself. And so, we know, that the normal process is when we talk about Christian nonviolence in the local mainline church, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, the response usually is, oh, geez, don't bother me with that stuff about Jesus and nonviolence. It's not relevant to my Christianity. And so the question has to be asked, remembering the McKinsey quote, if we cannot know from the New Testament that Jesus rejected violence, we can know nothing of his person or message. It's the clearest of teaching. Why is anything that Jesus says relevant to your Christianity, if this isn't? By what standard do you pick and choose and make some things relevant that Jesus said and some things non-relevant? It represents a very, very serious problem in the church. It wasn't always a problem. This was not always the case. Remember where we started. The world cannot have peace till trust in the mercy of God is revealed by Jesus. The refusal to accept Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friend or enemy is fundamentally mutiny against mercy. It is mutiny against the God of mercy. It's saying, I will not serve, by saying, I will serve my way or I won't serve. And so, reflecting, it wasn't always this way. This is not the way the community, this wasn't even an issue in the community at the beginning. Original Christianity was unanimously nonviolent. Apostolic Christianity is nonviolent. It rejects homicide and violence, period. We know that very, very clearly from the earliest story in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Stephen. St. Stephen is being torn apart by religious fanatics who have God on their side for killing. And we know what that is, because we've seen him. Christian, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, etc. There is no stopping them. And he responds exactly the way Jesus responds at the opening of the Acts of the Apostles. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Huh? And we know right there, because it says so, there's someone there helping them. He's got the cloaks of the ones who were stoning at his death, at his feet. Saul. And we know Saul is also a homicidal religious fanatic like so many others in the world yesterday and today. God is on the side of our homicide. Because we know he's on his way to Damascus. And he's up to no good. He's going to get him. And even when Ananias is told by Jesus himself to go help Saul, Ananias says to Jesus, Saul, you know, he was a holy terror. A violent religious fanatic. But once he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, the violent Saul becomes the non-violent Paul. Never, never, never again do we ever hear about him suggesting, even in any way, shape, or form, homicide and violence is the way. And that's the way it is all through the New Testament. And that's the way it extends out for almost 300 years. Now people will disagree. They'll say it's not 300 years, it's 175. Some will say it's 265. That's irrelevant. It can't go back beyond 175, that's for sure. The reason those arguments are made, whether it's 300 or 175 or someplace in between, is this: that there are 5 headstones of people who died that have inscriptions on them over from 175 to about 300, and have inscriptions on them that the man was both a soldier and a Christian. It does not say that he was a soldier and a Christian at the same time. That has to be the assumption in order to get that. Huh? There is nothing before that. But there is something very important here, just in that little thing that I'm talking about, the soldier and the Christian. What we do have in existence from 215 AD is something called the Apostolic Tradition of Hippolytus. And in the Apostolic Tradition of Hippolytus, which is the most important non-canonical document that we have, it's the most important document of the early church outside the New Testament, because it tells the workings of the church, the early church. It tells what the liturgy was, it tells what the Eucharist was, it tells what the sacraments were, it tells what the community discipline was, etc., etc. And in that Canon of Hippolytus, there is a section on the catechumenate. And the catechumenate in those days took years. 7, 10, sometimes the rest of one's life before the community would say, you are ready to be baptized. There was no 9-month program or something. And so, in that section on the catechumenate, section 14 says, I believe it's 14, says, if you want to become a catechumen, and you are a pimp, that is, you sell men or women for sexual purposes, you have to give up pimping to be a catechumen. I mean, we're really not asking much. This is kind of low-grade entrance, you know. Really, it's threshold stuff here. We're not... It's just clear. It's not the mind of Christ. You're not serious about putting on the mind of Christ if you don't want to give up your pimping. I mean, you come back another day when you garner some kind of conviction about this. Section 16 says, if you want to become a catechumenist, if you're in the military, you must inform your military superiors that you will no longer kill. If they will not accept that, you must leave the military. If you are not in the military, you may not join. It was absolutely as clear to the Christians of the around 215 that to engage in pimping and to engage in killing human beings were equally outside the mind of Christ. If you didn't want to stop that stuff, don't even begin to enter. The vast majority of most militaries in Western civilization today, and for the last 1700 years, of course, have been Christian. And so, this is how it was in the first 3 centuries. Basically, Tertullian summed it up when he said, when Christ disarmed Peter, he disarmed all Christians. It was understood. So what happens? What happens is this. In 311, I believe it was October 28th, 311 AD, Constantine is in the battle of his life. It's called the Battle of Milvian Bridge. It's not certain that he's going to win it or he's going to lose it. But Constantine is a worshipper of the sun, and anything else that will come along that will help him win. He has killed a lot of people just to get in this position, including brothers and sisters and father. He's almost got the Roman Empire in his grip. That's the sole emperor, the sole Caesar. Huh? But this battle is not sure. And so he sees in the sky a cross with the words, "In this sign thou shalt conquer."
We'll start.
And instead of viewing it just the way loving those who hate them, praying for those who persecute them, dying for others, and not returning evil for the cross is always a nonviolent cross. Instead of saying, "I will conquer in the nonviolent cross," what comes to his mind is, this is a totem. This is a piece of magic. And so that very night of October 28th, 29th, and 311, he paints crosses on every single shield, every single sword, every single spear, every single weapon, and every single soldier that he has. And for the first time in the history of Christianity, the cross is used as an ensign to lead people into the homicide and the brutality and the savagery of war the next day. He wins. And 2 years later, in 313, he issues what's called the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan was an edict that tolerated Christianity for the first time as a religion in the empire. Why did he do it? Not because he liked Christianity, not because he was a Christian. In all due respect to our Orthodox brothers and sisters who believe Constantine to be a saint, and we genuinely hope he is, and that's no joke, because the alternative is terrible. If Constantine is a saint, if he did become Christian, he became Christian on his deathbed, because for his whole life he worshipped the sun. But why did he then allow Christianity? Because he was a political fox, he was politically astute, he ruled the Roman Empire from 313 to 337 all by himself, and that takes brains. He knew what he was about politically. 300 years of violent Roman persecution, and 300 years of Christian nonviolent response did not issue in the liquidation of the Christian community as the Romans had hoped. 300 years of violent persecution, 300 years of Christian response resulted in Christianity at the time of Constantine being the largest religion in the empire. Tertullian saw it. He said the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians, or the seed of Christianity. The witness unto death is impressive. I can talk, you can talk, we can read books. But something else happens to a person when they see a human being give up his or her life for a truth. Nothing happens, of course, to other people when they see a human being kill others for their truth. That's zero, big deal. But to lay down their life for the truth and for a person without retaliation and revenge, that's what was getting into the Roman Empire. And the religion grew, and it grew, and it grew. And the Romans were not nice people. They were a barbarous people, if you can imagine what it would take to be in a Colosseum watching people torn apart by animals. Be that as it may, 300 years of Roman persecution, 300 years of nonviolent response, and not only wasn't the community liquidated, it flourished. And Constantine figured, as all smart politicians do, this isn't working. Bring them in. Start giving them some of the goodies. Give them nice stuff, and they'll get used to it, and they'll want it. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. It was in a short time after that Constantine began to use the Roman army to confiscate pagan temples and to give them to Christians. He began to give public buildings to Christians, etc. And all of a sudden, Christianity became a temple religion. Christianity was not a temple religion in its beginnings. It was not a temple religion for 300 years. Why? Because Christ was risen. Christ is no more in Jerusalem, he is no more in Jerusalem than he is in St. Paul. No more in St. Paul than he is in Tokyo. Where two or more are gathered in his name, there he is. Temples weren't necessary. Could be an upper room, could be a big room, small room, could be a big building. It was irrelevant. The consciousness was Christ was risen. And the reality was, this is what, in the dirt, in the ground, in the catacombs. We know the liturgy was celebrated there because we have the altars that were used and the things. So Christ is there. No temples needed. The temples, of course, were temples. Real, solid property rights. Good investments. And of course they begin to build life around them. And just as you would imagine would happen in the legislature here in Minnesota and in Congress if something like this were to go on, in about a generation, the politicians started saying, look, here we are, we've given them temples, we're protecting their temples for them, and inside the temples they're telling us those people out there who are killing people are bad, they're doing evil, don't associate with them. Now look, they got to make up their minds. They either want us to protect their temples, or they got to stop talking like this. If they want us to protect them, they've got to make some kind of adjustment here, or else we're just not going to do it. So the choice came. Keep the temple, make a little adjustment. What's the adjustment? Well, violence and all that bad on the proper conditions and so forth and so on. Or risk losing the temple. In 368, the first just war theory ever in the history of Christianity entered in. It was written by St. Ambrose. Not St. Augustine. Augustine was Ambrose's student, and that's a step later. St. Ambrose wrote the first just war theory. St. Ambrose is a miracle of grace in the church. He is a saint. And all saints have their strong points and their weak points. As Dorothy Day used to say, you know, if you follow a saint and what he or she did wrong, you go to hell. You don't imitate the saints, you imitate Christ, you know. And the saints are measured against Christ, not the other way around. At any rate, Ambrose is a miracle of grace. Ambrose belonged to the patrician family, leading family of Milan. Milan was to Rome like in America today New York is to Washington, you know. Rome contained and Washington contains all the political lackeys who were there for the wealthy. Milan is where the money is. It ruled. It was the city of money. All the money. Ambrose's family was like the Rockefellers except more. Anyway, at a time when the catechumenate took years, sometimes a lifetime to finish, for an adult, Ambrose went through the catechumenate, was baptized, was chrismated, confirmation, received into the Holy Eucharist, ordained a deacon, ordained a priest, and ordained bishop in 8 days. And then wrote the first just war theory. Ambrose was a brilliant man. He did wonderful things for the church. And the fact that that was able to happen is not an indictment of Ambrose. Something had to be going wrong in the church for a long time for that to happen. That is, for the just war theory to finally come in and all the things we're talking about. We often pick dates and persons like July 4, 1776, but really it's years before that, years after that. We just use that kind of as a benchmark. Then Augustine is the student of Ambrose. Augustine writes the just war theory as we have it today. But even Augustine says this is only a theory of state, number one, and that the individual Christian cannot employ it for personal self-defense. In that area, he or she has to imitate their Savior and die rather than kill. This is Augustine, the author of just war theory. And three, he never says there can be a just war. He says if there can be a just war, these standards are the ones that have to be met. And I defy anyone to find any war, any place, any time, under any conditions that have met Augustine's just war standards. That's the reason no church actually teaches it, while all churches say they employ it. Listen, or just go to your parish and ask anyone coming out of church on Sunday, what are the standards of the Augustinian just war theory, or the Catholic just war theory? I don't know, I guess if Reagan calls war or something. That's Augustine. And after that, you can imagine what happens. It just goes downhill rapidly. 200 years later, Council of Arles. There's a canon in the council that says priests, because of their superior sacerdotal position, etc., cannot use clubs in war. They can only use spears. But we start spinning down even further, the Crusades. Now we come to 180 degrees opposite the teaching of Jesus. Now we have come to the point where people can go directly to heaven, directly to Christ, by killing a Muslim. It was called a plenary indulgence in those days. The first plenary indulgences were granted for homicide. The first non-lethal plenary indulgence was to St. Francis for visiting the Portiuncula on August 2nd. Until that time, people were guaranteed heaven for the act of killing another human being, in this case a Muslim. And of course, once it was found out how well that worked against Muslims, it was only a matter of a certain amount of spiritual ingenuity and theological sophistication before it was switched into the Christian community itself, and heretics were killed on the basis of plenary indulgences. For example, the entire community of Albi, independent of what their teachings were, was wiped out on the plenary indulgences, Albi, France. When people went to auto de fe, the burning at the stake of Jews, these were just not feast days in which people came to watch the Jews burn at the stake and other heretics. They were actually granted spiritual indulgences for coming to these things. Now we're at the Crusades. The Reformation. Why doesn't anyone ask what Reformation? What Reformation? What are we talking about? Look, Henry VIII, Luther, the Pope, Calvin. They had differences of agreement about the metaphysics of episcopal jurisdiction and things like that, But you know what they all agreed on? They could slaughter each other and be following Jesus. Each other, no less. Catholics killed the Lutherans, Lutherans killed the Calvinists, Catholics killed the Calvinists, Calvinists killed the Catholics, Lutherans killed the Catholics, the Anglicans killing everyone, everyone's killing the Anglicans. All in the name of Jesus, all baptized, all the sacraments, however many they have, whatever it is. All doing it. Luther called the Pope at his time, Julius II. Luther called the Pope, Julius II, a cruel animal. And he was. Julius II was the last Pope to actually lead an army into war. He wasn't like these wimps we have today. They sit in the office, the air-conditioned office, sign papers, watch Saturday Night Live and send people off to die. Julius went out there and he fought. He liked the blood, he liked the gore, And he won. He's a cruel animal. But Luther, who said that about him, when those powerful princes who supported Luther and who simultaneously crushed the wretched of Germany, the oppressed, the peasants, and had them living like dogs, decade after decade after decade. When the peasants rose against the princes, Luther says, it is easier for a prince today to attain heaven by the bloodshed of a peasant than by prayer. The Calvinists, no question what the Catholics did to Calvinists, but the Calvinists simultaneously, they were stringing up Catholics all over the place for the Eucharistic doctrine. And of course, what can you say about Henry VIII? For what Reformation? What are we talking about? What's reformed? You just look 400 years later, Second World War. Catholics and Lutherans in the United States, bishops, priests, everywhere, sending Catholics and Lutherans over to Germany to kill German Catholics, and the Catholic and Lutheran bishops over, priests over there, sending them that way to kill. What Reformation? What kind of nonsense is this that we're talking about? And now everyone's killing themselves over worrying about the minutiae of words on pages, and no one's following Christ. In a matter of homicide, the clearest teaching in the gospel. And we wonder why we can't make any progress. But it seems to me the conclusion of all of this, at least the symbolic conclusion of this entire process of Constantinian Christianity, the low point, the spiritual low point, and God speaks through the signs of the times, is in our own time. It occurs on August 9th, 1945. An entirely Christian bomb crew takes off from Tinian Island with the second of the atomic bombs. It's headed for its primary target, which is Kokura, Japan. It has orders to drop the bomb only on visual sighting. It gets over Kokura, and Kokura is fogged in. Then, one of the engines goes out on the Great Artiste, which is the boxcar, which is the name of the plane. And the pilot, who's a Catholic man by the name of Charles Sweeney, and an entirely Christian bomb crew, they immediately turn the plane to the secondary target, which is Nagasaki. Because they got to get rid of the bomb. They can't land with it. If you've ever seen the Nagasaki bomb, it's called Fat Man. It's a huge bomb that they can't land the plane. They barely get off the ground with it. They get over Nagasaki, Nagasaki's fogged in. Now they got a bomb in their hands, an engine gone, and all of a sudden the bombardier sees below him what he's been trained to see. There's a break in the clouds, and what does he see below him? He sees the landmark that he's been trained to see for months over Nagasaki. He just presses the button and it's gone. According to logs of the boxcar, what he saw was, in the break in the clouds, and he was right, was the largest Catholic church in all of the Orient, the Urakami Nagasaki, St. Mary's, the Urakami Nagasaki Cathedral. Using that as ground zero, he released the bomb on the oldest, the largest, and the original Christian community in all of Japan, Nagasaki. There is nothing like Nagasaki in Japanese history. Just give me 4 more minutes, because this is important to see what's at stake here. When St. Francis Xavier lands in Japan, he is the first European there on August 15, 1649. He lands in a place called Kagoshima, which is a few kilometers from Nagasaki. He goes down to Nagasaki, and he was a genius at missionary work. He left behind him, before he left, a little community of Christians, Japanese, and a few Europeans. That community spread out all over Japan in a magnificent display of grace in the next few decades. Then, the Portuguese and the French try to pull in Japan what the Spanish and the English and the others, and they were doing in Latin America and in South America. They tried to use the missionaries as mechanisms and themselves to colonize Japan. The Japanese were too well ordered, too organized, and it was too far for them, The Europeans. They couldn't pull it off. Japan had no gunpowder when St. Francis Xavier landed. The Europeans introduced gunpowder to Japan, and 2 decades later, the Japanese had superior weapons to the Europeans. So once the Japanese caught the air that this is what was happening, that Christianity was actually becoming a tool for colonization and for enslavement of their own people, did they ever shut the door? They shut the door on Christianity like no nation in history ever did. They said to any European, get out of here or die. And they said to any Japanese person who was a Christian, which at this time was tens of thousands, give up that religion or be tortured and die. Tortured and die. And of course all kinds of them didn't give it up. And the tortures were incredible. But here's the point. The tortures were incredible, and you probably know the famous one about St. Paul Miki. He was a Japanese Christian that with 24 other Japanese Christians was marched in the winter from the northern part of Japan down to the southern part to where? Nagasaki, of course, because that was the center of Japanese Catholicism. And then he and 26 altogether were simultaneously crucified on Nagasaki Hill. And simultaneously 26 spears went into their heart. His feast day today is February 6th. That's Nagasaki. By 1600, there wasn't a Christian. But by 1700, there was not a Christian in all of Japan. Not one. They boiled people in water. They did what? Not one. And that's the way it stayed for over 200 years. Not one trace of Christianity. Then, because of trade, commerce, and other sorts of things, the Japanese in 1855 opened up a little island off the coast of Japan where Europeans could come and trade. Several years later, they allowed Europeans to come to one place in Japan only, on the continent, and that was Nagasaki. A few years after that, they allowed a little church to be built there just for Europeans. And in the evening, at 9 o'clock in the evening, on March 17th, 1875, a Father Pédajon, who was the pastor of that church, heard a knock at the door. He opened the door and there were 5 Japanese women. They came in and they said to him, which was a shock because Japanese never talked to him, although he could talk Japanese. No Japanese had ever been near the church before. And he asked them what they wanted, and they said, "Are you celibate?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Are you from Rome?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Where is the altar to the Mother of God?" So he took them into church and showed them a little side altar that was the altar to Mary. And then they turned to him and they asked him to come with them. And they revealed to him a community of tens of thousands of Japanese Christians that had existed in a catacomb state for over 200 years. They had it so precise that they had the liturgical days right down to the very day. There was no Eucharist because there were no priest or anything, but everyone was baptized. And they had a system of teaching doctrine and dogma and so forth as they had learned it, so that they had it all in place precisely. And the Japanese government did not know it for 200 years. When that was found out in 1876, the Japanese government instantly started another persecution. It had to stop, of course, because of the media and press, etc. In 1894, the Japanese government, for the first time, allowed the Christian, that is since the 17th century, allowed the Christian community to build a church. And where did they build a church? Nagasaki. From 1894 to 1917, the Japanese Christian community, basically Catholic community in Japan, built that church. Between 1894 and 1917, it took them over 20 years to build it because they were lugging a kind of stone down from one end of Japan to the other. And in 1917, they opened it and dedicated it, and it was the largest church in all the Orient. And that was ground zero for the Nagasaki bomb. A Christian bomb crew did in 9 seconds what the Japanese government could not do in 230 years. It liquidated the Christian community. And this is where Constantinian Christianity has led. We can tell of other things, the destruction in Latin America and on and on and on of Christians and Christians, and we can tell of all kinds of Christian to Christian destruction. But for one thing to have in your mind, it's just a sign from God of how horrible this reality is, of Christians destroying Christians. That baptism no longer means that a Christian cannot kill a Christian. Think of the Nagasaki story and what was ground zero. For that church did not just come up like you have a plan for a church in Minneapolis and you build a church. That church was put up under the influence of just historic levels of grace and cooperation with grace over a 260 plus year period. And that church was ground zero for the bomb. St. Mary's Unit, Urakami Cathedral. This is where Constantinian Christianity has led us today. And every week, every year on August 9th, now General Charles Sweeney is in the Boston newspaper saying he'd do it again, and no one in any church of authority says a word. No one. Which means the mindset is still the same. But this is Constantinian Christianity. This is its grotesqueness. This is not the teaching of Jesus. This is a lie. But this is what most of the church is accepting at this period of time. It is not true. The Council of Narbonne in 1045 said, to spill the blood of another Christian is to spill the blood of Christ. That's 1,000 years after Jesus, and it was still teaching the truth. Today, who thinks, really, that to spill the blood of another Christian is to spill the blood of Christ? Who thought that way during the Vietnam War, during the Second World War, First World War, Mexican-American War, French Revolution, you name it? So why don't I stop there with the history, and we'll pick this all up tomorrow morning when we begin at about 9 o'clock.